Hello and welcome to class. It's week 7 and we're going to be spending a little time on the discussion requirements for this week and a little more time on the paper than I had in the previous assignment video. So of course we're going to start out by checking our announcements. Those of you who've been going into class and checking your announcements, you are informed of all the things that are happening in the class and what's happening with me and why the papers were a bit late in being graded. But this is our main communication device other than emails. So as long as you go into class, always check assignments, and then we're going to go straight to week 7 discussion. And here we have what I consider one of our more straightforward and easier discussion posts, given our background already and that we've been dealing with this more or less for the entire class. So all you need to do is choose a global organization, and yes, you can use the one you've been dealing with throughout the class. However, it might not be a bad idea to consider a different organization, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. Then select the leader. Many times the CEO, of course, is going to be the leader. And then you need to compare how well they've done, the leader and the organization, on a domestic basis and then globally. And of course it would be very interesting to find a organization that has done extremely well domestically but not so well globally, or vice versa, done not so well domestically but done very well globally, and try to use that comparison to describe why one leader's performance in one setting may be effective and not in another. This would support some of our theories that the context or the situation makes a difference on how well the leader performs. Alright, but the real big deal is, of course, the paper. Now, I introduced the Week 8 paper requirements last week in the assignment, but I went over it kind of briefly, expecting that I'd cover more of the details as we got closer to the time when you would be writing it and working on it. So it's the same assignment. You're to write a long paper on a Fortune 500 or global organization, and it's allowed to use the one you've been working with or one of the companies you've been working with. Then you're going to also blend in your innovative leadership style that you developed for your Week 5 paper and show how this style will work in the organization. Now you may say, isn't that what we did last paper? Yes, you did, to a certain extent. And now all we have to do is kind of drill down into the next level and see how that style or approach and the company, how it's going to be effective at different levels in the organization. All right. So it's not totally different than what we've already done, and you should be able to reuse a lot of your material. It's just a matter of blending it in a way that answers this particular question, and then adding to it the material that's mentioned here below, where it says consider innovation, groups and teams, generational differences, etc. The other thing I'll remind you is class ends on Saturday in Week 8, and all work needs to be turned in by midnight on Saturday. Now, don't let this blow your mind. You can do it. I have confidence. And so let's take a look at the paper requirements in more detail. All right, we already talked about you need to choose a Fortune 500 or global organization. So you're going to be choosing something that would be recognized and we would be able to find information about. You're also going to be using your leadership approach that you developed in week number 3 and showing how it would be effective in the chosen organization. You're also going to show how this leadership approach could be effective in a similar organization. And that's why I mentioned for the discussion post you might want to look at a comparable organization so you could talk about how your leadership approach would transfer into another similar organization. Remember, a theory won't really be considered very valid if it can only be used in one setting. So you have to consider how applicable it is to other environments or other settings. Then the bulk of your paper will be spent addressing how this leadership approach will be received within the organization, what sort of resistance you might expect, how you would deal with that. And these particular issues are innovation, groups and teams, generational differences, corporate culture, and then how your approach would motivate followers and what types of influence strategies or tactics would your approach use. Okay, so I'll talk about kind of how the paper will probably be broken down in a little bit, but the idea is now we're going to be looking at specific issues with regards to your leadership style that you've developed and how your leadership approach would deal with these issues that are normally related to leadership. Of course, one approach is the Theory X manager. So I expect a few questions out of this. First of all, Professor, can I use the same company that I've been using in my discussion in previous papers? Well, as I've mentioned, yes, you can. In fact, it's expected. The class has been somewhat cumulative. If you went back and looked at our very first assignments and how they've been building upon each other, you should already have quite a bit of the material developed that you'll be using in this paper. Will I get penalized by SafeAssign? Well, SafeAssign does look for material that's already been submitted, so if your other paper contains exactly the same information that you're putting in this paper and it's written, basically it's copied into this paper, yes, it will catch it. However, in this situation, I look at the previous papers as drafts, and the final paper is the cumulative effort of all the drafts, the final draft, if you will. And if you're the author and you're drawing material from your previous papers, it will not be considered matching, and I won't penalize you for that. So don't worry about that if it's coming from your papers. Question 3. Oh, Professor, does it really have to be 25 pages in text? Does it cover page count? What about my reference list? No, the cover page and the reference list don't count, and no 25-page requirement is a recommendation or a suggestion. It basically represents the amount of effort that's expected in putting this together. If you turn in 12 pages, clearly that's not going to be enough. But if you have 23 pages or 20 pages and it's all very concisely written and there's no padding, I would prefer to read quality work rather than poor quality but excessive quantity. So it's up to you. You've kind of got to use your judgment as to how much effort you need to put into presenting your ideas. More facts. How many references should I have? Generally, for a scholarly work, you have lots of references, and not just any references. Textbooks, trade journals, popular press, company literature doesn't really count. You may need it when you're talking about a specific company to gather information, but they're not really considered scholarly references. And for a paper of this magnitude, really I would expect that you should have one reference per page. So 25 scholarly references to support the work. But you will be able to use many of the references that you've already used. That's perfectly allowable. You don't have to come up with totally new material unless you're writing totally new ideas. But what if I didn't develop a leadership approach for the Week 5 paper? Well, I guess it's time to start, because that's a major portion of what this final paper is all about. Now, if you're developing your leadership approach and you want some feedback before it goes into your final paper, you need to get it to me early. I'll review it and give you a thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether I think it's going to work in your final paper. Just send it to me as an email attachment saying that you're developing your leadership approach and you'd like a review of it before you start using it in your final paper. Oh, Professor, I don't think I can write 25 more pages. What should I do? Well, it's always a problem. End of class, you're running out of energy and running out of ideas, but again, you'll be reusing many of the ideas that have already been developed. You can think of the previous papers you've written and many of your discussion posts as material that is already developed for use in this paper. Then the new material is going to come from the additional concepts that have been added. For example, the innovation, the groups and teams, the motivation, the corporate culture. So if you cross-reference those terms, those ideas with leadership in your research, you're all of a sudden going to find new veins of information gold, if you will, that you're going to be able to use to support the rest of your paper. So I don't think there's any shortage of material once you start following these various paths from the central topic. So how to get going? Well, I thought about this, and I figured that maybe one of the best ways would just to give you what an outline of the paper might look like. Now, this is not a suggestion of the way that you write your paper. This isn't a sample that you should go by, but just a way to kind of get started. You're going to need a cover page. You can write an abstract. It's optional. You can supply a table of contents. That's also optional. You need to have an introduction that tells us what the topic for the paper is about and why you're writing the paper. You need some sort of justification why this is an important topic to cover. And then how you propose to explore the topic within your paper. All introductions should cover these three areas. How long should the introduction be? Well, if you're writing a 25-page paper, you should have a fairly detailed introduction covering what's going to show up in that paper so the reader can decide whether they want to go ahead and read it or not. So don't give me a 2 or 3 sentence paragraph as an introduction for a paper that's going to run on for 25 more pages. It's not sufficient. So part 1 of your paper is going to be presenting your theory, and I would think you would, assuming that you have to assume that the reader has not read any of your other material. You may be getting tired of it, but the reader is looking at this paper as the only paper on leadership, and especially your approach to leadership, that they've ever read. So I think it would be a good idea to provide some background on leadership and leadership theories to put your particular theory in context. And then a little bit of motivation about why we need to continually develop new theories in this particular area. And then present your theory, what it is. You can take this kind of from your week 3 paper. Then apply it in the selected organizations that you've chosen. The major organization, and then the second one to show how it's applicable. And then write your conclusions for part 1. Continuing on to part 2, here we're going to start dealing with the leadership challenges or issues in global organizations. So one is the issue of managing or leading innovation. What is innovation? Why is it important? How does your theory address managing innovation? And then your conclusions about this particular topic. Groups and teams. What is it? Why is it important? How does your theory address leading groups and teams? And your conclusions. Generational differences. What is it? Why is it important? How does your theory address generational issues? And then your conclusions. And then you would continue on with the other items, addressing them in more or less the same fashion. And this again will add a lot of bulk to your paper. And then at the end of the paper, you're going to draw your conclusions from the entire paper and recommendations drawn from your conclusions. And then your reference list. And again, this is not something the way that I want you to write it. It's just a way of thinking about the overall process and how you might start organizing your research and also your writing. So to wrap this up, the keys to success. Manage your time, as you've learned from previous papers, that proper editing and revisions, proofreading, corrections take longer than you might expect, and many times take longer than writing the first draft of the paper. So you got to plan for that. Plan that into your schedule, that you're going to have enough time to make the paper look the way you want it for presentation. Start researching those challenges to leadership subtopics and decide how you plan to address them. Again, that's really going to be the new material for this paper. So that's where you need to do your research. It might be a good idea, and this again is just a suggestion, is to set up an index of the articles that you think are relevant. You could use Excel as a way of creating a list of the references. You could note the authors, of course, and the titles, and a brief description of what's in the article. And then when you need to use it, rather than going back to the library and trying to look for it, you could just reference your list. You could do it by topic or keyword, and quickly find the reference that you want to use. Again, just a suggestion. Ask questions. As we wind up the last 2 weeks of this class, you don't have time to get stuck for long. You need to keep working. Avoid what we call analysis paralysis. Don't spend too much time thinking about it. If you can't answer a particular question, move on to the next one. Even if you don't see the whole picture of how it's all going to fit together, keep writing the individual pieces. At the preliminary stage, you're just getting your ideas down on paper or in the computer, as it would. And when we get to putting it all together, then we're looking at it from a different perspective. But that's a different stage. And if you try to combine these two together, you'll many times say, oh, I don't understand how this is going to fit. I just got to rewrite it all. You don't want to do that. You want to write, move on to the next, write, move on to the next, and then come back and put it together. Don't be intimidated. You've all written enough papers now in this class, and your discussion posts show that you're perfectly capable of doing this paper. So it's a matter of planning it and planning your time and staying busy at it. Because the next stop is going to be spring break.